John Bolton, the man who once said that Edward Snowden ought to swing from a tall oak tree, now faces 18 federal counts for sharing and storing classified material. Bolton thinks he should be treated differently because, well, he doesn't like Donald Trump, and because he was writing a book. But a release of Bolton's now hacked top-secret data would be, in the Iranian hackers' words, the biggest leak since the Hillary Clinton emails. I'll discuss the Iranian hack against John Bolton, something that nobody's talking about. But first, let me give you some background. I'm Ron Chapman, federal criminal defense attorney and former Marine prosecutor. I've prosecuted national security cases during the global war on terror. I've fought against the enemies of America. And on this episode of Off Air, we're going to discuss the enemies within. Here's the core of it. Bolton's book was a cover story. The Iranian hack of his system, another cover story. Plain and simple, Bolton is a spy. The only question is, who was he spying for? John Bolton's a former national security advisor, decades-long Washington hand. He's been indicted by a federal grand jury now in Maryland, and prosecutors say he created diary-like entries with top-secret details from intelligence briefings, situation room meetings, even covert programs, and he sent more than 2,000 pages of that to two relatives, purportedly, who had no security clearances. During this episode, you're going to see how these relatives likely were a cover story, how the book likely was a cover story, and how this indictment might lead to a much bigger investigation. We just need to ask the right questions. The indictment against Bolton also says his personal email was later hacked by actors linked to Iran. Bolton pleaded not guilty and says this is political, but is it? Yes. Trump wanted this. Does that make Bolton innocent? We're going to walk through what's alleged, what's provable, and what it means. And by the end of this, you'll see why John Bolton might be one of the most prolific spies in U.S. history, and I don't say that lightly. Bolton served as national security advisor from April 2018 to September 2019. And as the national security advisor, he had a top secret SCI clearance. That's the highest level clearance you can possibly have. He even had an accredited SCIF, a secure room inside of his very nice, well-appointed Maryland home. That SCIF was decertified shortly after he left the job, and I imagine he was probably asked to sign something saying he didn't have any classified information in his possession. That would have been, as a search warrant later proved, a bold-faced lie. The indictment in this case alleges that while in office, and for roughly 17 months from April 2018 through mid-September 2019, he regularly sent those diary-style write-ups, including classified information, to two, he claims, relatives, only identified in the indictment as individual 1 and individual 2. Why are they not specifically identified? Well, prosecutors don't like to put people they're not targeting in an indictment. What does this also tell me as a federal criminal defense attorney? It's possible that his wife and daughter, the purported individual number 1 and individual number 2, aren't actually the recipients of this classified information. And perhaps that is just a cover story. According to Bolton's facts, he would email through AOL, who uses AOL anymore, right? For Gmail, and sometimes through a non-government messaging app, daily briefings that he received, detailed notes of all of the information he received while he was in the White House. He even called this purported wife and daughter combination editors. They have no editing experience, and purportedly his daughter has a Yale degree and works for Nissan, of all companies. Well, on April 8th, 2018, there was an exchange before he officially started, and it shows a group chat that was created by a relative. Bolton replies, "For a diary in the future," in a notation in that group chat. He created a chat specifically for the purposes of creating a diary in the future, for the purpose of probably creating some sort of cover story. That same section of the indictment explains his entries often began with lines like "the intel briefer said," or "while in the situation room, I learned that." Then he would include classified information. He later rewrote these notes into word processing documents to send out. To whom? We're not quite sure just yet. But in a moment, I'm going to show you a clip where Bolton lays out in his own words what punishment should await people who disclose classified information. Before we roll it, note that prosecutors say the two relatives aren't named in the indictment haven't been charged. Citing an AP person familiar with the case, AP reported that they were Bolton's wife and daughter. That's where we get that information from. Now, let me ask you, listeners of Off Air, what kind of man subjects his family to this kind of exposure? Well, that would be somebody who has much bigger things to protect. 13 years ago, during the WikiLeaks firestorm, Bolton told National Review that he'd charge PFC Bradley Manning, now Chelsea Manning, with treason, and reminded everyone that treason is punishable by death. Now, I want you to watch this video and keep Bolton's suggested punishment in mind.
And I hope he gets at least 176 years in jail for what he did. I'm not bothered by the death penalty in this country, and I think crimes like espionage that harm the security and the safety of innocent American civilians deserves this. The view is that Snowden committed treason. He ought to be convicted of that, and then he ought to swing from a tall oak tree. Well, he should be prosecuted, and if he's found guilty, he should be punished to the fullest extent possible.
And what is that?
Death.
Each count carries up to 10 years. But let me tell you this, if Bolton is found to have been intentionally leaking information that could harm people, well, that's treason. And that carries the type of punishment that Bolton thinks Chelsea may. If he's spying, that's treason. Bolton says you get the death penalty. Now, what kind of information are we talking about? Well, not the kind of information you would ever put inside of a book if you're John Bolton. That's why the book story is a BS cover story. The counts are summarized in a table listing the specific information that was involved, something strangely the mainstream media has decided not to discuss, the information and the potential damage. The information here includes intelligence that a foreign adversary planned a missile launch, details of a U.S. covert action, special intelligence, signals intel, and human intelligence derived from sources and methods, some marked no foreign, meaning not to be released to other foreign nationals. So if Bolton's writing a book and he's going to release that book to the public, you would imagine that taking notes that included classified information and blatantly putting it in a book would be a really bad idea. You would think that you would not want to actually take that information out because it's not usable for the purposes of your book. You would imagine that if the book is going to be read and reviewed by people in intelligence, that you probably wouldn't want to get close to this type of information so that you could publish your thoughts and opinions on what happened without having them get tangled in this sort of classified information. So why did John Bolton, somebody who's an attorney, was well respected in Washington for a long time of government service, and knows the punishments for leaking classified material, why would he blatantly put such secure information into an email and send it out exposing his wife and daughter? And that's a question that we are absolutely going to unravel and get to the answer to. But first, back to the indictment. Count 1 describes future attack intelligence that he sent outside of government channels, outside of classified channels. Count 6, direct quotations collected via sensitive sources on a foreign country's interactions with an adversary. Count 8 of the indictment, details of a U.S. covert action were disclosed. That's the information that John Bolton decided to send to, purportedly, his wife and daughter. Bolton was asked about the punishment that should await Julian Assange should he come back in the United States. And he said, I hope he gets at least 176 years in jail. Bolton doesn't have 176 years left, but it's possible these charges could be upped to something with a capital ticket. Meanwhile, every liberal news organization jumps on the idea that this was an attack on a good man. It's strange how everybody who has a position different than Donald Trump automatically becomes good, and we stop looking at the bad. This was a man who didn't care about them at all when he was calling for Snowden's head, when he was calling for Julian Assange's head, and when he was engaging as a pretty hawkish Republican during the Bush administration related to the war on terror. He didn't care about their positions at all. But Now that he has a book and he has a fight against Donald Trump, he's jumped into the arms of MSNBC and the mainstream media. The Bolton defenders jumped to the networks almost immediately. He was writing a book. Yes, Bolton wrote a 2020 memoir. It's called The Room Where It Happened. That book includes very detailed accounts that clearly were written from memos like this. The Justice Department tried to stop it, not Donald Trump specifically, as it's been reported. And Reagan appointee Judge Royce Lamberth let it publish. But what did he say to John Bolton in an order before letting it be published? He said that Bolton likely jeopardized national security and gambled with national security by bypassing parts of the pre-publication review. Still, one key line in the new indictment says that none of the classified details at issue were published in the book. What does this mean, ladies and gentlemen? This is very important and likely to be the biggest piece of evidence against John Bolton. Well, it means that every time an editor on the pre-publication review said this is classified material and it cannot go in the book, that would have been knowledge that that information possessed by Bolton in his own home, in his own email address, and that information that he disclosed to his own daughter was classified, meaning that he was in possession and had disseminated classified information. Every email back and forth describing this being classified or that being classified and being omitted from the book is knowledge. Easy case for a prosecutor to make. So the book was never a get-out-of-jail-free card, and it was never going to be a smoking gun towards Bolton's innocence. It's a separate thread that proves he knew clearance rules, he knew the stakes, and he knew the type of information that he possessed was classified. According to the indictment on July 6, 2021, Bolton's representative told the FBI an entity believed to be the Islamic Republic of Iran had gained unauthorized access to one of his personal email accounts. This is specifically from the indictment. Now, what does this sentence mean and why is it so important? Why does this suggest that John Bolton might have been one of the most prolific spies in United States history? And why does this suggest that the Biden administration might have covered this issue up? Well, let's talk about that in detail. July 6, 2021, very interesting time. Joe Biden is president of the United States. January 6th that happened, and special counsel is appointed to look into Donald Trump specifically. One of the indictments against Donald Trump related to the possession of classified information, but not classified information that was hacked by Iranian spies. Classified information that was in his Mar-a-Lago house after he, the original classification authority, apparently had it taken there. That indictment has been dismissed. But around that same time, Bolton was in possession of his own classified information. And around that same time, his representatives reported that the Islamic Republic of Iran had gained unauthorized access to one of his personal email accounts. Did the FBI then question Bolton? No. Did they raid his house? No. Did they seize the devices? No. I've dealt with national security investigations. I've also dealt with investigations like this before. And one thing I will tell you is that any law enforcement officer worth a salt would immediately interrogate the devices to see if the hack went deeper, to see if there's anything planted that will collect classified information, and to do an immediate scrub on just about everything related to John Bolton. There also would have been some inquiry into the scope of the hack by doing interviews and asking certain questions. There might have also been a search of the house to make sure that there was nothing in his possession that was classified. But instead of that happening, Bolton decided to lie to the FBI, and the FBI decided to allow it, and the Department of Justice decided to not do anything about it, at least not do anything about it until Donald Trump became president of the United States. Weeks later, after this Iranian hack, the Iranian hackers forwarded a threatening message implying that the leak content would be exposed. It would be the biggest scandal since Hillary's emails. And they said that they would be deleting the compromised account. Bolton said he would delete the compromised account. Now, this is very suspicious, ladies and gentlemen, that the federal government, when receiving an email like that or communication that hackers had gotten a hold of an account, would just allow Bolton to delete the account instead of the FBI doing a full investigation. Why would that happen? Obviously, because the Biden administration doesn't want what could be discovered if that account came to light and came into the FBI's possession. Let John Bolton delete it, let this disappear, and don't do anything about it. Prosecutors at that point did not tell. Prosecutors add in the indictment that at no point did Bolton tell the FBI he used that account to send documents relating to the national defense, classified information. That matters because if hostile actors rifled through the account of John Bolton, one of the people who is exposed to the highest levels of classification, the exposure isn't hypothetical, it's real. And the fact that this information was potentially leaked to Iranian hackers and potentially spread across the globe is one of the largest dangers to the American public and our allies that we have ever faced. Remember, the type of information included in the counts dealt with very classified stuff: future attacks, human intelligence. Spies might have lost their lives as a result of John Bolton's conduct. The Biden administration and Merrick Garland didn't investigate. They didn't prosecute. They didn't do a search warrant. They didn't question Bolton. Instead, Merrick Garland appoints Jack Smith to raise allegations and search the home of former President Donald Trump on June 8th, 2023. Now, after receiving this information about the potential biggest leak of information since the Hillary email scandal, the Biden administration decided to engage in another cover-up. They didn't investigate, they didn't prosecute, they didn't do a search warrant, they didn't question Bolton. Instead, Merrick Garland appoints Jack Smith to raise allegations and search Donald Trump's home. And on June 8th, 2023, Donald Trump was charged with something that Bolton was never charged with at the time: handling classified material. But he's the president. He's the original classification authority. Vice President Joe Biden also took classified material to his home, but he wasn't the original classification authority, and he wasn't charged because he claimed, or at least the investigation after suggested, that he was not mentally well enough to face the charges, but somehow he was mentally well enough to remain as the president of the United States. Then Donald Trump was elected, and Bolton was no longer safe, and Biden was no longer safe. And on August 22nd, 2025, the FBI searched Bolton's home and office, seizing electronic files and printed hard copies of his diary entries. Some of the documents were marked top secret SCI. The Biden administration's failure to look into this when the Iranian hack was reported caused top secret SCI information to be held in the possession of a civilian for an extended period of time. Now, those searches have been a turning point that moved the case from just whispers to full-on charges. Earlier this year, Bolton scolded the use of non-government apps like Signal for sensitive discussions. In one interview, he said there's just no excuse for it. And hear the standard in his own voice, and then compare it to the conduct that we have here in the indictment. Now let's talk about that potential criminal liability. As you know, these counts raise a potential sentence of 10 years. Nobody would get that. Most of these cases, unless they involve direct espionage, would be handled with misdemeanor pleas, maybe a felony plea, and in some cases there's some jail time. But things get a little bit more expensive for John Bolton if there's actual espionage, or if there's harm, or if he knows that there's some sort of disclosure, such as an Iranian hack. If Iranian-linked actors accessed the very accounts used to transmit the diaries, and those diaries contain the level of detail described in counts 1 through 8, missile planning, covert operations, liaison reporting, then the risk isn't theoretical, it's operational. The indictment even notes one diary was printed with a sticky note style message saying, "None of which we talk about," to which the relative replied. Bolton says the materials were unclassified personal diaries known to the FBI since 2021, and nothing charged ended up in his 2020 book. But we know that's not the point. Here's where the conversation gets uncomfortable for Bolton, but also very important. If these allegations are proven, what do you call a year-plus stream of top-secret classified information about day-to-day White House activities and national security business flowing to uncleared recipients, who knows who they really were, over personal systems that adversaries then compromised? Do we call that careless diaries? Do we call that misdemeanor style stuff? Or do we admit that the effect of this resembles the work product of a mole sitting inside the West Wing and reporting his day-to-day activities? Critics say, at a minimum, Bolton did exactly what he once demanded others be executed or imprisoned for. He set a standard. Now his conduct is going to be measured against it, and some of you are already asking the next question, which is the very important question to answer, and I'll give you a bit of a preview before the next episode. Was Bolton working for the CIA? Was Bolton working for Obama-era holdovers who despised Trump? Was he helping a foreign power? The charges right now don't suggest that, but Bolton's cover story, the Iranian hack, the very clear transmission outside of classified government channels, tells a different story. When you read how the notes allegedly detailed specifically what intel briefers said while in a situation room, and you see those tags on the things that he was creating purportedly for his own use in a book, you come to realize that there's no way that this information was for a book. And the tag, the intel briefer specifically said, is noted to identify that this information was coming from a specific intel briefer. You start to get the picture that John Bolton may not be who the mainstream media thinks he is. He disclosed details of covert actions, of intel briefings that were classified. And when you pair that with an Iranian-linked compromise of the same account, and with a complete failure to investigate that compromise, you can see why people suspect there's more than just some sloppy journaling for a book. It's possible, if proven, that the scale of exposure would rival some of the worst espionage damage assessments we've ever seen, even if John Bolton's motive was different. Let me be direct about the stakes. The charge sheets list classified information. If a foreign service or entity reads those lines, lives could be lost. Long-built access and relationships with our allies could be compromised. People could be harmed and maybe have been. That's why each count carries up to 10 years. But if Bolton knew this information was getting to outside channels and covered up something like the Iranian hack, we could see a superseding indictment that might include charges much more serious than just handling some documents with some markings on them. Watch for prosecutors to lean on Bolton's own language. For diary in the future, he said when he set up the group chat. Look for them to expose his on-air condemnation, some of the stuff that you've seen in the clips today. Look for them to point to his use of non-secure apps and sharing with people who don't have a need to know. And when we find out who this wife and daughter combination really was, if it wasn't his relatives, then this case is going to get a lot more. No, instead, this case looks a lot more like Bolton setting up plausible deniability. As a prosecutor, I've encountered a lot of computer cases, and the common excuse is, oops, I was hacked. But when you have that report of a hack coupled with a lie about what was on your devices at the time of the hack, you start to get a little bit closer towards obstruction of justice. Bolton was building his plausible deniability with that sort of story, and one very uncomfortable truth is that Bolton wasn't blindsided by classification rules. Judge Lamberth's order in 2020 warned that he likely jeopardized national security. But instead of listening to that, Bolton decided to blast officials for using Signal for sensitive topics early on in the Trump administration. Expect for prosecutors to bring that out as well. It's possible that John Bolton, if the allegations are proven, has done the kind of sustained, wide-scope harm to national security that history associates with the worst spy cases. Remember, Bolton wanted Snowden to swing from a tall oak tree. Ask yourself, what sentence would John Bolton recommend for someone who did what the indictment says he did? What sentence would John Bolton recommend for someone who did what the facts also show he did? He's already told us. The standard is set. Now, if you found this breakdown useful and something unique and interesting, please like the video, subscribe, and share it with somebody who is still buying the book narrative that Bolton wants you to buy.